If you're struggling to get started with your novel research or you're drowning in endless information, then keep watching. These are the tips that I've used on my debut and my second novel to research smarter, not harder. So let's get started. Firstly, research is not a single action. So, this is one of the biggest mistakes I made when writing my debut novel. Bearing in mind, I was and continue to work full time in marketing alongside writing novels. I spent many months on research before I even began writing. So my mind was totally overwhelmed by everything I'd learned, and the story was struggling under the weight of all these facts. So, what I've learned for book two, and what I'd suggest for you to do at the beginning, is to research just enough to get started, probably a lot less than you actually need. You only need the broad brush information, enough to create a basic structure for your story. Then, while you write your first draft, you can make a list of things you need to research later. This time it's going to be much more focused on the things you actually need to do rather than a scattergun approach where you end up with a ton of research you didn't need or use. And my next tip talks more about how research is like an iceberg and how it can help to create a better novel. Below and above the iceberg. So, when I was drowning in research for my first novel, I read a really helpful article that suggested we need to think of research like an iceberg. And the key principle behind this is that first and foremost, people want to read a novel and connect with fictional characters. They don't need to know every little fact and figure about the setting or period. And if they do, they can read a non-fiction book or travel log on the topic. And if you're worried that you're doing all this research that you might not end up using in your novel, try thinking of it this way. So, the research a reader sees on the page will literally be the tip of the iceberg. Meanwhile, there's all this other research that you've done that isn't directly used in your actual novel, but it is helping you as a writer to create an authentic world. On to the next tip, take research into real life. So now, whether you have to research a particular setting, a historical time period, or a topic, you might think the best place is to start with a non-fiction book. And whilst these have their place, there are better ways to really make your writing jump off the page. In my early drafts of my debut novel, Kololo Hill, I sometimes forgot that I'm not only trying to bring a particular subject to life for a reader visually, but also in a three-dimensional way. So, how things might taste, sound, feel, smell as well. And why is this important for us as writers? Because if we can't truly make these settings feel real in our mind, then how can we ever do that for our readers? So, you could try some of the following. Researching with the five senses, so reading first-hand accounts such as online diaries and blogs, or watching vlogs on YouTube, of course, which will give you a feel not only for location but also the food, the music, and the social history of a place. And YouTube also provides first-hand accounts and news archives. And one thing you might not have considered is that YouTube is also a goldmine of sounds. So when I wanted to write about the sound of crickets in Uganda while I was writing back in cold and dark London, I found lots of videos solely with the sound of crickets. And even if you can't visit a particular location, Google Earth Street View lets you walk around a place. So this is exactly what I did with my debut novel, long before I actually did a research trip to Uganda. You might be able to get recipe books from a period or location. And while some ingredients might be difficult to get hold of, you might get an approximation of the food your characters eat and cook. And you could also visit your local museums and interactive exhibitions. At my local museums, the V&A in London, they had corsets and other clothing you could actually try on for yourself. And I was able to use these details in my writing in a way that you wouldn't really get from reading a history book. Next tip, focus on the unexpected. So if you're writing about a particularly well-known topic, you want to use your research to give a freshness to your story, because everyone knows that there were rations during World War II, but was there something unexpected that was rationed that we might not have known about? I use the fact that people used rosehip a lot in their cooking during World War II, for example. So try to bring something new to this topic or setting that you've not read before. And on to the next tip. Research is not one and done. Now, this next tip is going to help not just with your research, but it can be a good way of bringing more tension and interest into the actual story itself, or even giving you a totally new idea for a novel. And it might be tempting to read one book or find one source of research, but if it's going to play a big part in the plot of your story or your setting, it's going to pay to look at a couple of different options and not just because of accuracy. It's also where sometimes the most interesting conflict can be found for your story. There's a quote that's attributed to Winston Churchill that doesn't just apply to historical fiction, but all genres. History is written by the victors. The quote actually predates Winston Churchill. This is what happens when history actually is written by the victors, I guess. But whatever genre you're writing in, try reading authors with different perspectives from underrepresented backgrounds or different countries from your own, because you might find an interesting conflict or tension in the points of view that can help to bring your story to life. Now, gathering all that research takes time, and so does keeping it all organized. So my next tip is about how to use AI to do exactly that. Use AI to organize your research. Now, full disclosure, I'm still trying to work out where I stand on using AI for a lot of things. And there's definitely some ethical questions that I'm trying to better understand as a writer who obviously has copyright in my own work. But I think that in the research arena, it can be a useful way for novelists to research faster. Firstly, illicit.org. So this is something I've just discovered, but it's essentially a research assistant that analyzes research papers at what it calls superhuman speed. And it can search for relevant papers for you and provide one sentence summaries. You could also use something like Notion, which people are now starting to use to plan their novels, and it can be used for research organization into categories, color coding into different sections, etc. But Notion have also just released Notion AI. Now, I believe this is currently still in beta, but you can try it out on Notion now. It can summarize an article in a couple of sentences, so you could add these to the top of each of your articles, and when you go back to reference them, you can quickly find what you're looking for, or even compare a couple of different topics side by side in a comparison table. And of course, AI will continue to evolve, and there's likely to be more tools out there that will help us writers in future, so keep a lookout for those. Now, I know that even with all this advice, research can take up valuable time, as can every part of writing a novel. So if you want some time-saving tips to make more time for actual writing, and which help me finish my debut novel while working my day job, you might like to watch this video next. See you in the next video.